What's going on, guys? Hope you guys are having a great day already, because today we are gonna be talking about filmmaking basics and technically the things that I've learned when I started filmmaking. So there are three things that you must know before you hit the record button on your camera, which is the shutter speed, aperture and ISO. If you guys don't know what shutter speed, aperture and ISO are, I hope you guys learned something from this video. But if you already know what they are, I hope you guys still stay tuned, because maybe you can learn something from these videos as well. Anyways, imagine your eye as your camera. Every time you blink, you take a picture. Every time you hold the shutter button, your shutter opens and closes and it takes a picture. So I think about shutter speed, aperture and ISO like an eyeball. The shutter speed is your blink rate, the aperture is how wide or narrow you open your eyes, and the ISO can be how much light you are sensitive to. So this is like an analogy, your eye is like your camera. So to explain it more clearer, let's say you are taking a picture of someone moving, or like a car passing by, or someone that is cycling, and there's like a lot of motion blur in that picture. So to remove that motion blur, you usually go for that high shutter speed, so that when you snap the picture, there won't be any motion blur inside. Sometimes you want that motion blur in your photos or your pictures, then you go for a slower shutter speed. So the faster the shutter speed you set every time you snap a picture on your camera, you have little to no motion blur in your photos. Another thing about shutter speed is that the slower it is, the more light it can absorb, because the shutter is exposed to light for a longer period of time. Basically, the faster the shutter speed, the darker your footage, and the slower the shutter speed, the brighter your footage. But when it comes to filmmaking, it's actually kind of different when it comes to shutter speed. So when it comes to filmmaking or videography, it's actually different from taking a picture, because there's this rule, which is the 180-degree shutter angle rule. So what it means is that your shutter speed must be 2 times of your frame rate that you're recording at. So let's say you're recording at 24 FPS, then your shutter speed will be 1/50th of a second. If you're recording at 60 FPS, then your shutter speed will be 120th of a second, and so on. So this rule is actually the standards in the film industry, because it is supposed to mimic the motion blur we see with our own eyes. Anyways, let's talk about aperture. So from what I understand about aperture is the amount of light that you are letting into your camera. So imagine it like your eye. The bigger you open your eye, the more light you are letting in. And the narrower you open your eye, the lesser light you are letting in. So it goes the same as your camera. The higher the aperture, less light is gonna get into your camera, and the lower the aperture, more light is gonna get into your camera. So let's say you put your aperture to the lowest your camera allows. For me, my camera allows me to put around f1.8. So this causes like a really big separation between your subject and the background. And also another thing that about aperture is that it can cause this effect, which is called bokeh. Bokeh. Is it bokeh or bokeh? The pronunciation of that word has always been such a mystery for me. Like, is it bokeh or bokeh? You know, some people pronounce it that way, some people pronounce it the other way. I'm not sure which one should I say. So I'll just say both, bokeh and bokeh. So basically what bokeh is the blurry parts of your video, or the parts where you didn't focus your camera on. So let's say if I focus on me, then my background is gonna be very blurry. So let's say I want to focus on the subject, which is me at the moment. I will go for a lower f-stop, let's say f1.8, then the camera will just focus on me, and I'll sacrifice the background, because the background will be totally blurry. But when it comes to recording landscape, or if you want the background to be clear, then you have to go for a higher aperture, so that your background is in focus and I am also in focus. And that's technically what aperture does. So, but the drawback about aperture is that if you put at a lower aperture, your footage is gonna look a lot more brighter, because you're letting more light into the camera. But if you put at a higher aperture, yeah, your background, your whole footage is gonna look extremely tack sharp, crispy, sweet, beautiful. But the one drawback that it comes with is that your footage is gonna look dark, because you're letting lesser light enter your camera. So this leads us to ISO. So what ISO is I'll kind of call it artificial light or fake light, because that's not the technical term or like the scientific term, but I don't think you need to know what the scientific term is. You just need to know how to use it and what it does. So the higher the ISO you put, the more artificial light you're putting it into your camera. Your camera sensor is becoming more sensitive to light the more higher ISO you put. But the drawback about this is that the higher the ISO you put, the worse your video quality is gonna get. So this is where you see those noisy footage, those really grainy dots that you can see in your videos. That usually comes from either poor lighting, or the ISO you put is way too high up. But usually people use ISO during low light, so when there's very less light coming into your room, there's no window light, you use ISO to replace that light, to fill in those gaps inside your videos where it's dark and you want it to light up. So certain cameras have certain ISO limits, so if you put it way too far, your video is gonna just tear into pieces. You just look like a rainbow, you see those different color greens going on in your footage and it just looks so bad. But if you're going for a certain look, then you can't change your shutter speed or your aperture, then you'll be forced to increase your ISO. And that's technically what ISO is used for. It's just artificial light used to brighten up your footage, but just don't overuse it or else it's gonna make your footage look bad. Anyways, we have come to the very end of the video. I hope you guys learned something from this video, and if you haven't already, hit the like button and smash the subscribe button because I would totally appreciate it. And yeah, I'll see you guys soon, maybe in the next video, who knows? And stay positive and stay tuned for my other videos, and bye bye!